joining us as well, and she'll be recording tonight's program, and she's going to help me make sure people get admitted and when they're in the waiting room, and then also help with questions if needed. So our presenter is Rene Damon. She's a literacy engagement activist who's worked to empower families and communities through inclusive programming, cultural strategy, and inclusive workshops that center belonging and bridging. She's an educator with over 20 years of experience working with students and families as a history teacher, librarian, and literacy consultant. She's the 2020 Library Journal Mover and Shaker Honoree and a recipient of the Leadership Lamp Award for Equity by Democrats. Janet recently presented her program, Raising Anti-Racist Kids, for the Louisville Library, which got excellent reviews from participants. Please join me in welcoming Janet Damon.
Hey, welcome. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I hope you are warm and cozy in your house since we had a little snow, a little rain, and a little sunshine, beautiful Colorado weather. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. One of the things that I really hold as really being powerful in this work is the power of co-creation, that in this space, we are all teachers and we are sharing knowledge and sharing experience. And that is what creates that beloved community, is when we take an opportunity sometimes to also be vulnerable and to show up with our whole selves. And so I'm gonna get ready to share my screen. And so thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Janet Damon, and if you are interested, I also am on Twitter at MixMama, and then also on Instagram with Afros and Books. And so tonight, one of the tools that we're going to use just to be able to engage on in a conversational space is I have a bit.ly link. I'm gonna, let's see if I can. It's actually bit.ly/beyondbias1. If you want to put that in, it's all lowercase. And a bit.ly is really nice for sometimes sharing, because we're able to kind of use this space to get to know each other a little better. And this is really important when we do this kind of work. And so I'm going to click on it just to show you what it looks like. And so in our presentation tonight, you'll see that I'll have some moments where we'll pause and we can use the Jamboard. And actually, let me just drop that as well into the chat for you too. Okay, so there's that direct link as well. And so one of the questions that we can just start with is, where are you from? What place feels like home to you? And so you'll see that you can click on this little sticky note, and then it'll give you a variety of colors, and then you can answer the questions. So you'll see my answer as an example that's here. I was born in Nuremberg, Germany, but now Denver feels like home. And so up top are these arrows that you can go through some of the different questions, but you can also wait until the presentation comes to that place and use this space to kind of share a little bit and let us get to know you a little bit. What's also nice is that there are 3 dots here on the side, and at the end of the presentation, you can download this as a PDF so that you can truly learn from and with all of the participants who are here tonight. So I'm going to come back and revisit that. I'm going to give folks a minute to kind of drop some different notes onto the board, and I'll go to our next slide. So tonight, my greeting to you is Sawubona. And Sawubona comes from the Zulu tradition of South Africa. It means I see you, I see your gifts, I see your needs. You are important to me, and I see you in the wholeness and fullness of who you are. And the response to this is Shikoba. I am here for you. And if you see me, then I am grateful and happy to know that I exist for you. And this hints at something that is truly powerful, in that we all arrive here with different needs and different gifts. And our gifts are meant to be shared, and our needs are meant to be supported. And this idea of Shikoba, that I am here, and once I have come into your focus, your lens, and you see me in my wholeness of my humanity, then I have come into existence for you. And too often we think we can tell one another's story just by seeing one another's outward appearance. But to go deeper and to truly see one another, we have to open that space up for true listening and attending. And that is what bias gets in the way of. So tonight, we're doing this work in service of the ability to be in relationship, in true community with everyone that we encounter, that we can actually move beyond the limiting beliefs of bias, and we can tap into the powerful power of belonging and of affirming one another. And so, you know, tonight is an invitation. It's an invitation to examine, explore, and reflect. We're going to look at the ways that our brain perceives, sorts, and creates inferences about people and communities. We're going to explore the conditions that cause our bias to manifest. And we're also going to just look at some practical steps that we can take to reduce our bias and to increase our capacity for bridging and belonging across. All right, so first, let's come to a common definition of what is bias. Those attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding and our actions in an unconscious manner. And so these biases, they encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments. And so one thing that's important is that bias is different than explicit racism. So some folks, you know, they've come to a belief about the world that they're rooted in very explicit behaviors that are racist. But implicit bias is something that we all carry. These are part of the system that we are saturated in, that we have grown up in. These are images that surround us in media. These are reflexes, so to speak, that come up because of a myriad of reasons that we'll go into tonight. But that bias is something that, implicit bias is something that happens involuntarily and without our intentional control. And sometimes it's directly counter to our norms and our values in the world. So implicit bias is something that we have to think of as a habit and a reflex that we are trying to overcome and recognize that we carry. So let's look at our first question on the Jamboard, besides our introduction. So I'm gonna come here just to reflect and think about what are some ways that implicit bias impacts your world, your experience. And I see so many wonderful introductions. I'm gonna move some over so I can see them. Oh, Louisville feels like home. I love that. You've been in Lafayette now for 14 years. Oh, that's wonderful. So feel free to shuffle and move your Jamboard comments around Northern California, but calling Denver home. I think Denver, you know, we have a lot of transplants here who find themselves feeling quite at home here. So that question comes up, implicit bias. And so how has it impacted, how has it affected your life or your family's life? And so you see my comment here that one of the things that I do in response to implicit bias is actually find ways to protect my self-concept and my mental well-being when I have encountered implicit bias and when I've been, you know, in situations where it has diminished me and it has kind of taken its toll on me. Some other ways that it can impact, you know, us is, you know, do we feel sometimes that we are overcompensating, that we're afraid to engage or speak or share or build relationships with people who are not similar to us, and that causes a different kind of belief around how we can engage and be in relationship from people who are different backgrounds. And so just take a little bit to reflect on implicit bias. Has that impacted your life? Has it impacted your family's life? And then what are some ways you feel comfortable in sharing that? And so as we go, we want to think about one of the folks that I really hold as being just a phenomenal and groundbreaking researcher in this work is Daniel Kahneman, and he is the author of Thinking Fast and Slow. And he's an Israeli psychologist and economist who has done work on the judgment and the decision-making that we have. And one of the things that's really interesting that he, in his book, talks about is that we have two kinds of systems that are at play. And, we have a systems one thinking that is really fast. It makes split decisions really quickly. It's automatic, intuitive, and very unconscious. And then the other system that goes into play is our systems two thinking, which is very slow and deliberate, and it's our mode of reasoning in the world. And so you can think of it as, when you're scanning, a room and you're thinking of where to sit, that's going to be comfortable for you in this big room. Your brain is making a lot of decisions, and it might lead you to find a table with people who you perceive to be similar to you, right? Or that you're drawn to, and you're not really conscious of it, but you're just kind of carried forward. Whereas, if I asked you to solve a math problem, you would have to slow down and go into systems two thinking. If you are going through your email, you're going to have to read, and then you're going to have to construct a response, and that's kind of that systems two thinking. It's so funny in this work, there's something we're starting to see now called email apnea, where people, because they're shifting from one kind of thinking to another as they're reading these emails, they're starting to hold their breath and they're not breathing through. And so our brain is responding to a world that is full of decisions that need to be made. And so, we are exposed to as many as 11 million pieces of information at any one time, and our brains can only functionally deal with about 40. And we make a ton of decisions every single day. And so this, 35,000 decisions, we are going to want our brain to help us by making some of those decisions very quickly and without a lot of intentional thought. And then other decisions we want to be thoughtful about. And so when the brain is doing that, it opens up for a lot of mental shortcuts and heuristics and things that we're doing to make that less strenuous on the brain. So the brain is always working on a system of efficiency. And so you're taking this biological sense, and we're also looking at this through a culture that is really saturated in racist structures, and white supremacy and structures that are hierarchical. And so this leads to this two kind of like our hardware meeting a software that is also coded for bias. And so in this work, we have to think about the fact, Dr. Patricia Devine, she's a phenomenal researcher in her work in stereotypes and prejudice and how to disrupt it. So just someone you should really, think about and learn more about her work. But she talks about awareness within this system is not enough. So awareness within the self system is a level for self-regulatory change, but even people who are motivated to overcome bias, they don't often fully understand that challenge of overcoming prejudice. They think being motivated is enough. And in fact, the persistence of implicit biases against change in those beliefs is not sufficient. So when we want to do better, we see things in the world that upset us, that go against our values, for equality. And yet we also need actual skills. So it's not just the will, but it's the will plus the skills to do things differently in the world that help us to become less at risk for making biased and prejudiced and basing things off of stereotypes. And so tonight we're going to talk about some of those things that we can do to disrupt bias. But first, we have to really deeply understand how much implicit bias impacts the lives of those in our community. And so one of the examples is the stereotypes and how they show up in medical practices. So even as recent as 2016, a study found that white medical students wrongly believed that Black people had a higher pain tolerance than white people. And of the participants, 73% held at least one false belief about the biological differences between races. And so even though they were studying and they, on this level, understand human physiology, there was still this, again, going back to this software of looking at the world through a racialized lens that impacted even their decisions making. So the implicit bias was able to override years of medical study and all of this research, you think about the 12 years of schooling that medical students may go through, that implicit bias still comes through. And what's interesting in some recent studies from the medical community is that patients feel it. Patients are able to, when they did the Harvard implicit bias study with medical students and doctors, and then they did observations of doctors with patients, and then they had the patients complete surveys of how, what the interaction was like with the doctor. Those who had the highest bias were also the ones that the patients recognized were doctors that didn't listen as much to their needs and didn't provide the kind of, there were micro expressions that the doctors made that kind of let the patients know that this bias was in play. So then the patients were less likely to want to take the advice of the doctor because they felt like bias may have impacted what the advice the doctor was giving them. So this becomes a very circular, very insidious process where the bias is felt by the patient, the bias is felt by other people, and then when there is a poor interaction, it leads to confirmation bias for the doctor. So the doctors were like, well, this patient didn't listen to what I said, and that's why, so it becomes a kind of an ongoing process because nothing is disrupting it. And then we look at stereotypes in schools. And so even though Black children represent 18% of preschool enrollment, but they receive 48% more than one out of school suspension, while white students represent 43% of preschool enrollment and only 26% of out of school suspension. So what we kind of see is that the behaviors that students, all children might be exhibiting, because a teacher's lens is impacted by that bias, they may perceive one behavior as being worthy of, call to the parent, in an office visit, or maybe even a suspension. But for another child, they might see that behavior as being rambunctious and playful. And so, bias impacts our decision making, especially when we're making a decision in the heat of the moment, when we're making a decision based on just a little bit of information, and we're in that systems one, very emotionally driven decision making. But this can have a big impact on children because when we know about out of school suspensions is that a single suspension for a high school student doubles the chance of them dropping out, and that students who are expelled are 3 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. And so the ramifications of implicit bias are far reaching. And that is why it's so critical to recognize that this is something that we all carry because we have grown up in a culture, in a nation that has media that reinforces it, that we have interactions that we see on television that reinforces it, that we hear constantly, different things that are triggering some of those responses, and yet we're not given a lot of tools to disrupt that. And so, a lot of children may not ever have an anti-bias training or workshop in elementary or middle school or high school. And so then we're wondering why we see this carrying forward into some of the interactions they have all the way into adulthood. And so one of the things that, stereotypes impacts is the justice system. So in a study where, a neuroscientist, Elizabeth Phelps, looked at participants, the region of the brain when they were seeing Black faces, and the amygdala activity spiked, that they felt threatened or afraid. And this impacts the way that sentencing, that judges and that juries might let implicit bias kind of creep into their decision-making as well. And again, we think about the future and the power of the future and technology to help us reduce our bias, but what we found, and there's a great book called Algorithms of Oppression, is that deep learning algorithms, they have a problem in that they adopt the bias that is in the data on which they're trained. And so, there have been studies that have shown that there's challenges in looking at the data that comes with medical information, because that is, we have so much privacy around that. But in a study that they did on a huge amount of data that was being used for decision making, that the program had learned not to give pain medicine to Black patients who were in need of it, and had bias toward providing this medication and more rapid response medication to those who are the patients who are white, because it was taking the historical data from how this hospital was making decisions, and it was learning how to use the same bias in the code. And so this, especially as AI is increasingly used to make decisions in medicine and law enforcement, even in sentencing, and then in banking, who gets a loan, who gets, what's the amount of loans, how much are properties refinanced for in different zip codes. These are legacies of redlining. These are legacies of discrimination. And so even as we look to the future and we think that we are becoming more equitable, at the same time, we have not done the work to examine even how we can construct a future and how we can use technology to reduce bias. And so, it's one of those things that we have to examine with deep thought and with deep honesty about where we are as a culture. And so I'm going to pause, and I'm going to ask, and let's just check our Jamboard, because I know that some of these questions, we need some time to really chew on them a little bit. So let's take a look and see on our page 2 about the bias and how has it impacted your life or your family's life. Where we sit, where we choose to be, always sitting in the back of the room, close to the door, with all the moving. I was never comfortable coming all the way in the room and sitting all the way down. And this resonates for me. I have definitely seen and definitely myself made decisions on placement. Where is a place that I will be able to be comfortable, be present, but also not be at risk for, different implicit bias that may show up as microaggressions in eye contact is one of those things. Or I have experienced at one point, there was a colleague of mine who had to meet some folks at a conference hall, and she sat down on the bus, the charter bus that was taking folks over, and as an African American woman, she sat right there, front, second row, and every person who got on, this was a library conference, so all the librarians who got on looked at the seat next to her, but no one sat in it. And so by the time she arrived at the event, it caused her a great, enormous pain, because she thought, that's a consistent othering. And so, the things that happen, those decisions, they are made because of a sense of protection. I'm aware that implicit bias exists and ways to protect myself. Oh yes. And I want to learn and recognize and avoid implicit bias as much as possible. Absolutely. I've taken the Harvard IAT test to learn more about my own biases, and the results in some areas surprised me. And I appreciate knowing where I need to be more actively conscious of my leanings. I love this. This is wonderful. This is so much. Thank you so much for sharing. I hope we have a moment to come back at the end for folks to be able to unmute and talk a little bit about what sparked them to take that step in that journey. So let's take a look. Okay, so examples, if you want to think about, what are some anti-bias practices that you have used to counter your implicit bias? So just drop some strategies that you've used, and we're gonna go ahead and pivot and talk about some strategies that I think will be useful as well. So how do we disrupt these systems of heuristics, these mental shortcuts that the brain is using that, and what's important is that, when we think about, and in the workshop that we talked about for, how to raise anti-racist kids, we talk about how at 3 months old, babies are showing preferences. They have a preference for those who speak the same language as their caregivers. By 6 months, they have a preference for those who share the same facial and physical characteristics of their caregivers. And so we have this great opportunity when children are young to expose them to a myriad of different faces and people and cultures and backgrounds. But we also have to recognize that in the United States, we have a history of segregation and of separation, and sometimes that doesn't always happen. And so what we want to think about is as adults, where we are now in knowing that we carry implicit bias, what do we need to do to change it? And so one thing is really important is that we have to actually be motivated to change our habits. This is work that requires a lot of self-regulation and a lot of self-awareness and self-reflection. And we sometimes forget that, implicit bias as a system is a system that we've all bought into in a way, so that it is fueled by our decisions, it is fueled by our habits. And so the work we do that is internal work, that is self-reflective work, we are changing the root. We are grabbing the problem at the root and the source, and that is where we create real change. So to be deeply motivated, that we want to have a change in the way that we interact with folks in our community and folks in our world, and recognize that we're responsible for the work of bridging and belonging. So bridging and belonging and creating spaces and connections is an active and a work that requires our full participation. And so it doesn't just happen for us, especially now, especially in our country right now. It is work. It is work to heal and to repair harm and to engage in the bridging and belonging. And know that we can adapt. We can be more inclusive. We can be more intentional, and we can create a world that is really worthy of our children through this kind of active engagement. So first, strategy, stereotype replacement. And a lot of these come, from Dr. Devine's work. She has some strategies that she has, looked at, and there's research that supports this kind of, that these techniques can help us to be able to stop the bias as it comes up. So one thing we have to recognize, it will come up. It'll come up for me, it'll come up for folks on the call. And so when we realize we're having a stereotypical thought, we identify it, we flag it, we note it. You know what? That is not based in reality. I have tapped into a stereotype, and then we want to replace it with the egalitarian thought. We want to ask ourselves, where did this thought come from? Why did it arise? And the more we're intentional, we're retraining the brain to say, you did it again, but we're going to get better. We're going to do better, because we're moving from that systems one, where we're reflexive and we're pausing and we're saying, wait, where did I get that idea from? Is that something that I've seen on TV and movies, and now I'm putting that and projecting that onto folks who I've never met and haven't talked to? So replacing that stereotype as it comes up and recognizing it with intention and with mindfulness, that we know that we're doing that. The other technique we can use is counter stereotypic imaging. So when we think about all of the people and the faces that we see in the world, we have so many different ideas that are not based in our own experiences, but are based in experiences that we have gotten from other places. So with counter stereotypic thinking, we want to really think in our minds about the people that don't conform to that stereotype. So it's making this idea that that when we see faces and we see identities, that in our mind, instead of attributing a stereotypic thought to them, we instead want to think about all of the people who have contributed and done amazing things for our world, who might be from that place, that culture. And so we think about the egalitarian, the equanimity of the human experience, of who these people represent. And so instead of saying to yourself, when you look at, like, as a Black woman, someone might say, oh, she's probably carrying the whole family on her shoulders. Instead, they would pause and say, she is probably just doing so much for her community, similar to other women like her. Maybe you would think of other Black women who, Maya Angelou, or other folks who are doing amazing things in the world, who have done amazing things. And instead of attributing to me a diminishing idea, you would attribute to me an idea that builds capacity and power and connects to an inheritance of culture for me. And so what we see is that, especially in education, this is powerful for teachers, that we see limitless potential in the people, and especially in the children that we encounter. And that belief around the limitless potential, around the power of every individual to do great in the world, like those are the things we want to tap into, because that immediately taps us into profound beliefs about those who are in our world and our community. Individuation. So sometimes, when we first meet someone, we attribute who they are to a group. And so if I meet, for example, a new colleague and, I see that she's a white woman, I would attribute characteristics to her that would come through this lens of her identity as a white woman. However, when I pause and disrupt that by saying, let me learn more about her as an individual. And so what I might find is that, who are her parents? Where did she grow up? What are some of the things that, she did as a child? And so the more you get to know someone and inquire and fill in the gaps so that you're not, implicit bias functions when you don't have a lot of information and you're making snap judgments. And so the more you're able to slow down that process and ask yourself, how can I engage with individuals and just get to know them a little bit better? And so this allows people to see each other as individuals, as we all are. And it allows us to tap into, too, the stories, the actual lived experiences. And that is where we are able to build those connections that a beloved community would have, that we know each other and that we see each other, going back to the Shikoba, and that we exist for each other. The other piece is perspective taking. So, we've always talked about, to walk in someone else's shoes, or to think about, how they might feel when we think about, the things that come across our mind, or the stereotypes that we bring into a situation, to pause and think about, how would I feel, thinking about the medical bias that we talked about earlier, where I would be uncertain that every doctor I was having an encounter with is actually giving me information that is based on my condition, or that they're actually caring about whether or not I am getting well. If that were me, how would that make me feel? So what do I have to do to make sure that these systems are equitable? And that's what spurs us to action, because we all have power in this system to bring about greater equity in our world. And so to disrupt it, we first have to understand and believe that it exists, and then how that operates, and then how do we use our voices in service of everyone having equal access and equal, respect and belonging in a system, in a society. So tapping into that capacity for our compassion and our empathy to build that perspective. And then increasing opportunities for connection and belonging. And so I talk a lot about this with the parents, and we have an opportunity, especially with our children, to engage in wonderful classes and learning experiences where they're going to meet and build connections and friendships with children from across different backgrounds, different cultures. And that's critical, because, having those experiences helps them to see the world as an inclusive space. When we really don't provide students and kids and ourselves a lot of opportunity to build these cross-cultural community, we miss out on what that fullness of humanity looks like. And especially in our nation, we are at a tipping point. Of the 74 million children in the United States, more than half now are children from diverse racial and ethnic cultural backgrounds. And so we want to ensure that as we prepare our children to be successful in the world, that means that they are able to collaborate, to communicate, to partner with folks from a myriad of different backgrounds. And so having a healthy and diverse social network is incredibly important. And it doesn't take a lot. You know, I tell people, signing up for classes, finding shared interests, you know, doing events and going to parts of the city and visiting even different businesses, those are the ways that you can kind of begin to engage in expanding that social network. Because, you know, I say we are human beings are incredibly social beings. We're designed for it. We're designed to be in community. Racism and bias takes us out of community. It makes it hard for us to build bridges and to be in relationship with people from all different backgrounds. And so I'm going to pause really quickly and come back to our Jamboard so we can take a look at the last question and then look a little bit forward to the, okay, I'm going to take another look here. I acknowledge, I find myself acknowledging my implicit bias when I note a person who is present in my quite homogeneous community and assume that person probably doesn't live here or is from outside. That is powerful. Even though the statistical likelihood might reflect a reality, I try to disrupt the thought and embrace another possible reality. This is so powerful. And so thank you so much to the person who shared this, because you know, when we think about, this is one of the things that we see when we saw folks calling to say someone is doing this or someone is here, because in their mind, belonging, who belongs in a community and who does not. And this is powerful that you're pausing to hold that thought and acknowledge, no, like anyone can live, you know, where we live. We live in the United States, people can choose all the communities they live in, but this one is a really powerful one because we've seen it play out time and time again, where folks would carry forward to the point where, you know, they were calling police. So rooted in them that this person could not possibly, taking that pause, asking, and I love the fact that you put in here the statistical probability. And so absolutely, like, you know, this is where we can really begin to disrupt our bias and also provide a model for other people to do the same. So thank you so much for sharing that. Challenge thoughts immediately. Yep, and that's powerful, to challenge the thought. And then I read to learn more about people who are from a different race, culture, religion than my own. I'm conscious of doing my own research rather than seeking the knowledge from just one representative from race or culture or gender. Books are pretty awesome. They do take us into and allow us to see the world from a different perspective. And so that, I think, is really powerful. And it allows us to really appreciate the journey that people may have taken. That, you know, when we look at just as many different experiences that people are having in our country that are not always the same as our own, that taking the time to read about and educate ourselves about what those experiences are like will allow us to tap into that, our own humanity on a different level. Smiling, I love this, you know, simple, but it is, you're welcome. It is part of, you know, there's a whole neurological response to a smile, right? A smile, it triggers a smile in the other person. It helps with the release of oxytocin. That's the bonding, happy neurochemical. So these are all important processes for making sure that people know they belong. Being curious about other motivations, role playing with my kiddos. What do you think that might be? And then also, I love to show them, even my kids, you know, sometimes we'll watch clips of what would you do? There used to be this TV show where they would put a scenario on, and then, you know, what do real people do when the scenario is playing out? And for my kids, you know, they were really surprised, you know, who stood up and who spoke up, and then who didn't speak up. So that's a great way to just, you know, spark that conversation. I would have to, you know, ask myself if I would have had the thought I'm having if the person were white. And if the answer is no, I know I need to dig deeper. That is gold, right? Like that pause and just to ask yourself that one question and then see where that takes you. And that inquiry, that self-inquiry is where we can see transformation. And that, again, we can model a different way in the world, which inspires other people to walk in the world in a different way as well. So thank you. Notice, pay attention. And so let's pause and think about what practices are resonating for you. Which would you try? Would it be the replace, counter stereotypic imaging? Would it be individuation, perspective taking? I heard perspective taking in the last, screen on the Google board and the Jamboard. Increasing those connections and opportunities for belonging. I find personally that's the one that I do a lot. My children. I'm very intentional about just showing up for different events and supporting different events in my community and different cultures in my community. I live in a pretty diverse part of Denver, and I love to just make sure that my children know that in our community are people from different religions, different gender identities, and so we want to be in community with everyone who makes up our neighborhood. So we show up at all kinds of celebrations, and sometimes we are the only Black and Korean family there, and that is good. That is good because as the night goes on, they always come back and say, "Wow, there's so much we have in common," and that is true. So I'm going to come back to my slide here. So go ahead and feel free to drop any practices that resonate for you, things that you might try. And then, I would love for you to think about what are some questions that come up? What are some aha moments? And I'm going to take us to this quote, and then I'm going to come back so that we can dig deeper and do some conversation. But, it's not our differences that divide us, but our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And Audre Lorde is a phenomenal essayist and poet and activist who left so many great lessons in her works. And so I highly recommend an Audre Lorde read if you haven't read her before. But I see there's some questions in the chat, and so I'm gonna come over. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much for adding those links for everyone. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen really quick. So we have a little bit over 10 minutes, and I'm going to come back to the Jamboard because I know folks are adding to it, but I also invite for us to have some Q&A, some discussion as well, and then I'll go back to the Jamboard to pick up some comments from there.
And Janet, I wanted to mention too that the two books that you mentioned, Thinking Fast and Slow and Algorithms of Oppression, are both available at the library. So feel free to check out.
Yes, those are great. Those are great. And hopefully you have some Audre Lorde as well. She's very, I feel like right now, she has been, really, it's great to go back and reread some of her essays because her work around and her discussions of intersectionality and how we show up for one another and how we explore. And I do feel like that bridging work and pairing that and looking at how oppression doesn't show up in just one way for a person, but there are different identities that we all carry, and some of them make us more vulnerable, but since some of them also give us power and privilege in places that aren't always visible. So I can look at myself and recognize that in many ways, my education has protected me from some of the harms that and given me privilege and access. And so how do I ensure that the lived experiences of my elders who might not have a degree, but have lived through and have so much value in their wisdom and knowledge are also elevated and just embraced for that power of lived experience. Sometimes we forget to acknowledge the power of that. I'm going to go back just real quick to see our Jamboard and see if there's some comments that have come up on the Jamboard, and then so replacing the stereotypes and counter stereotypes seems like a positive and doable action step. Yes, I love it. Increasing the opportunities for connection. I love this. Counter stereotyping keeps coming up for me with my son. I bet that man is a loving father, teacher, helpful member of his community versus powerful, money focused careers. Those just, and I love this that you are modeling this with your son. And so for our children to be able to see us embracing the discomfort and moving through and learning a different way of being in the world is really powerful, because it models for them how they can do that themselves. And I think that as parents, we're always transmitting lessons and ways of being in the world with our children. And you know, they say the first language is body language, right? Like we learn to read body language before we learn to read books and texts. And you know, when children see that we're uncomfortable in situations or we're uncomfortable with different groups of people, they internalize messages. And they also, if we're denying it and we're like, no, you know, I believe, you know, that everyone has a right to be here, but then they see that we kind of stiffen, or we kind of like, are like, why are they at this pool? Or why are folks, you know, playing baseball on this field? Does that family live here? Then they're getting this conflicting message, and they're realizing we don't talk about it, but these are the ways that we monitor and deputize ourselves to regulate in these systems. And so having conversations with our children, modeling for them how our thoughts, and making our thinking visible for them, that, you know, even to share with them maybe some bits about how we grew up and whether or not, you know, it was an inclusive space for us. So, you know, one of the things I talk to my daughters about is that, you know, my family, we grew up in a very racially diverse, my family was military, so we moved to like 7 different countries. And, you know, but at the same time, my parents they lived through a time where they first began to have conversations about, you know, LGBTQ plus communities, gender expansive communities. And they modeled for me a beautiful journey of loving and accepting and supporting the rights of all individuals. And that my father and I just had a talk. He was talking to, my uncle is 80 and my father is 70. And my dad was advocating that my uncle be more open-minded and inclusive. And again, reaffirming for me, even as an adult, that this is the journey. There are things yet to come and yet to explore, but to have a respect for the human dignity of all individuals is a core lesson that we can transmit to our children. Talking to others about implicit bias, especially in situations where it might have impact, that is powerful. And again, that is the change. One individual can change an entire trajectory of practices in a school, in a community, in a workplace, by being vocal and using our voice in service of that. Audre Lorde has a quote, you know, that my silence has never protected me. Your silence will not protect you. While we're waiting for this expansive moment to finally speak our mind, we lose a part of ourselves every time we are silent. And so there's a way that we are really meant to speak up and to use our voices so that, you know, we can make a change in those moments. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's so powerful. And so some questions, more aware of my implicit bias around class and financial status. I think that is something we do not talk about enough. And this is one that I think is so normalized. In fact, I was looking at some research that said, you know, our unhoused community members experience the most othering and the most, you know, when we think about extreme othering, you know, our body language, not even making eye contact, all of those things are kind of normalized around class, financial status. And so, and so those are thank you so much. Those are incredible nuggets, and I just appreciate you so much for sharing. Kids don't listen to us all the time, but they see what we do. Thank you, Elizabeth. That is so true. They are really watching us and absorbing from us ways of being and habits that, you know, we want to let them know. And I think kids are really attuned to honesty. We don't have to be perfect, but we can say, you know, this is something that I didn't grow up with, but this is something I'm committed to being fully engaged in, you know, and that what is your hope and dream for the world? I think talking to children about what we hope and dream in the world is a way to also begin to manifest that. And our kids are going to carry us a lot farther than in some ways into this equity journey, I think, than we thought possible. So we have 5 minutes. I just want to honor folks' time. If there's a burning question or a thought that you